In the depths of a dense, damp jungle, a group of prisoners of war, POWs, huddled together, seeking solace and warmth. Ravaged by disease and hunger, their bodies weakened, they endured grueling 12-hour shifts imposed by their Japanese captors. As they desperately attempted to rest before another arduous day, their ears were met with the piercing screams of one of their fellow captives. In fear and resignation, they closed their eyes, silently praying that they would not be the next targets. Night after night, their comrades disappeared, their fate sealed as the air became saturated with the sickening smell of burning flesh. The cannibals feasted on the flesh of their own kind, casting eerie shadows through the jungle trees. War, with its horrors, had transformed men into monsters, and World War II stands as a stark testament to this fact. The Nazis perpetrated mass genocide, exterminating millions of Jews and those who did not align with their ideology in Europe. In the Pacific Theater, both sides committed countless war crimes. However, amidst this backdrop of brutality, a chilling secret emerged, one that involved the consumption of human flesh by POWs. Brace yourself as we delve into several documented cases of cannibalism during World War II, knowing that these stories lack any semblance of a happy ending. On September 2, 1944, an American bomber soared towards Tsushima Island, situated south of mainland Japan. The aircraft carried a crew of 9 brave men. As they approached their destination, anti-aircraft guns unleashed a barrage of projectiles, filling the sky with explosions and shrapnel. Despite the heroic efforts of the pilot to evade the Japanese countermeasures, a shell struck the wing, causing the plane to jolt and the engines to falter. The pilot urgently conveyed to the crew that they were going down. In a desperate bid to survive, they hastily dropped their payload, completing their mission. Now, their focus shifted to evacuating the aircraft before the impending impact claimed their lives. The turquoise expanse of the ocean came into view on the horizon as the plane hurtled towards its doom. Time was of the essence. The crew strapped on their parachutes and, with a leap of faith, leaped into the sky while still above Tsushima Island. The pilot, valiantly striving to give his comrades the best chance of survival, maintained the plane's stability. Only when the last crew member had safely disembarked would he make his own escape. Hovering over the vast ocean, he knew he had no alternative. Making a split-second decision that would determine his fate, the pilot opened the cockpit and leaped into the open air. Plunging into the waves below, he activated his life preserver, finding himself adrift as the stricken plane continued its descent, smoke trailing from its crippled engines until it ultimately crashed into the Pacific Ocean. The pilot gazed upwards, watching as the parachutes of his crewmates descended towards Tsushima, vanishing amidst the dense jungle canopy. After unclipping themselves from their parachutes, the crew cautiously maneuvered through the thick foliage. Tragically, the island was under Japanese control, and enemy soldiers swiftly located and apprehended them at gunpoint. The American soldiers were bound and held captive, their fate at the mercy of their captors. As the sun rose on the following day, the Japanese soldiers began subjecting the Americans to brutal torture, desperate to extract valuable information. The war in the Pacific had raged for nearly 3 years, and both sides sought any advantage they could muster. Throughout the conflict, POWs had endured mistreatment by both Allied and Axis forces, as captors resorted to cruel tactics to obtain vital intelligence. However, the Japanese regiment in Tsushima would take these atrocities to a new level. The American airmen were subjected to unspeakable torment, stabbed with bamboo spikes, subjected to waterboarding, and relentlessly beaten. Despite the excruciating pain, they steadfastly refused to cooperate, determined not to aid the Japanese cause. In the face of their captors' frustration and realizing that the prisoners would never yield, the Japanese soldiers resorted to decapitation. The heroic actions of the American soldiers would only come to light when their remains were discovered, exposing the horrifying fate that had befallen them. The extent of the food supplies available to the Japanese soldiers on the island remains unknown, but it is widely reported that they were not in a state of starvation, as ample resources were available. Consequently, comprehending the subsequent events becomes an even greater challenge. When Allied forces eventually seized the island, the Japanese were compelled to surrender. During the reconnaissance and securing of the island, the Allies uncovered the remains of butchered and consumed American soldiers. The bones bore knife marks, attesting to the removal of flesh. Japanese Admiral Kenizo Mori later testified that their chef had pierced the livers of the American soldiers with bamboo sticks, subsequently cooking them with soy sauce and vegetables. Some theories propose that, according to certain Japanese belief systems, consuming the liver of an enemy soldier granted the eater courage and power, offering a means to overcome adversaries. Nonetheless, the liver was not the sole part of the POWs' bodies that were consumed. Additional Japanese soldiers reported that their commanding officer, Lieutenant General Yoshio Tochibana, ordered them to consume the flesh of 4 American soldiers who had landed on the island. Perhaps most disturbingly, this was not an isolated incident. The motives behind the cannibalism on Chichijima remain somewhat obscure. While some soldiers who partook in the gruesome act may have been driven by desperation and starvation, numerous accounts suggest that the Japanese officers deliberately orchestrated these acts of human sacrifice on the island. Regardless, all 8 men who crashed on Chichijima ultimately perished, with at least 4 of them falling victim to consumption by Japanese soldiers. As the plane descended towards Chichijima, the pilot who had bailed out moments before watched with anguish as his crew landed on the inhospitable island. Surveying the surroundings for any signs of rescue, he found himself confronted only by the vast ocean and scattered debris from the crash. The current slowly carried him farther away from the island's shores. Suddenly, an ominous disturbance emerged from beneath the surface. The ocean churned and swirled around him, as if a colossal creature were rising from the depths, ready to devour him. Frantically, he struggled to swim away as the peak of a submarine broke through the water's surface. It was the USS Finback, dispatched to locate and rescue survivors of downed aircraft. Filled with relief and gratitude, the pilot swam towards the submarine. Though concerned for his crew, he understood that there was nothing more he could do for them at that moment. As the sailors aboard the Finback pulled him to safety, they inquired about his name. George H.W. Bush, he responded. Unbeknownst to all on board, they had just saved the future 41st President of the United States, George Bush. Bush continued to serve alongside the crew of the USS Finback in rescuing additional downed airmen. Yet, the fate of the men from his own plane would remain unknown for years. It wasn't until 2003, when a researcher pieced together the puzzle and presented it to the former president, that Bush learned of the horrifying fate he had narrowly escaped on the day his plane crashed near Chichijima. Regrettably, this instance was not an isolated occurrence in which American soldiers faced torture and cannibalism at the hands of the enemy. In another chilling account, 2 crew members of a downed B-29 bomber were captured and taken to a medical facility, where they became subjects of macabre medical experiments. According to one medical student stationed at the facility, the blindfolded soldiers were brought into the laboratory, under the impression that their wounds would be treated. However, the reality could not have been more sinister. One of the US soldiers was injected with salt water to observe its effects on the body, while the other endured the horror of having his chest sliced open and a lung removed. The doctors sought to study how the respiratory system would respond with just one lung. These stories from World War II serve as grim reminders of the depths to which humanity can sink during times of conflict. They expose the monstrous acts committed by individuals who have become desensitized and dehumanized by the horrors of war. The accounts of cannibalism, torture, and inhumanity shock and appall us, shattering any illusions of happy endings in these narratives. The sacrifices and resilience of those who endured such unimaginable suffering should never be forgotten, serving as a haunting reminder of the atrocities committed during this dark period of human history. During that time, there were numerous medical experiments conducted on prisoners of war, just two of which have been mentioned here. The sheer horror lies in the fact that some of the removed organs and body parts may have been consumed by famished Japanese soldiers. The war inflicted both physical and psychological trauma on many individuals, and cannibalism was not an isolated occurrence, it spanned across the entire Pacific theater. Each instance of cannibalism was more terrifying than the last. After the war, the atrocities committed by the Japanese Suzuki unit stationed in the Philippines were brought to light. Deployed at the onset of the war to suppress American and Filipino resistance in the Bukidnon region, the unit faced a grueling environment characterized by intense heat, humidity, relentless insects, and debilitating diseases. Struggling to sustain themselves, the soldiers resorted to foraging for food and pilfering from local mountain villages as supply routes were severed. As the battle with Allied forces persisted, an increasing number of Japanese soldiers succumbed to malaria and dehydration caused by diarrhea. Unit doctors concluded that a constant source of protein was necessary for the soldiers to remain healthy enough to continue fighting. However, in the dense jungles of Bukidnon, finding such sustenance was an arduous task. The Japanese resorted to slaughtering and consuming local farmers' pigs, livestock, and chickens, leaving them with no protein source except for bugs and other humans. They began consuming the bodies of prisoners who died from illness or injuries. Some prisoners of war were executed, skinned, and cooked immediately to feed the Japanese troops. According to testimonies from Japanese soldiers, they would often sneak into nearby Filipino villages at night to find victims for cannibalism. Using the cover of darkness, they would approach lone individuals, rendering them unconscious with the butt of their guns before transporting them back to camp. The soldiers would then extract meat from the victims' skeletons and consume it to acquire the much-needed protein. Human flesh would sometimes be boiled with vegetables, while at other times, it would be left out to cure under the sun. It is highly likely that the Suzuki unit's cannibalistic acts were driven solely by the need for survival, although surrendering may have been a wiser choice in hindsight. Upon the capture of the Suzuki unit by American forces, the camp revealed a gruesome sight: human flesh still in the process of cooking and human skeletal remains strewn across the ground. It became evident that the Japanese soldiers had subsisted on human meat for a considerable period. Examination of the remains indicated that many of the consumed individuals were Filipinos. While 9 members of the unit received death sentences for their actions, it is probable that many more resorted to cannibalism to avoid starving to death. For the Japanese soldiers, surrender was not an option. They would rather fight to the death than yield to the Americans and bring dishonor to their country. Even if it meant hiding in the jungle and sustaining themselves with human flesh for years, they remained resolute. Before the official outbreak of World War II in the Pacific, Japanese forces strategically secured various points, including Papua New Guinea. In the early stages of the conflict, Japanese troops were dispatched to establish airfields and naval ports, with the ultimate aim of launching an assault on Australia. They captured soldiers from India, Singapore, and other parts of Asia who were assisting the Allied forces, forcing them into constructing the necessary wartime infrastructure in Papua New Guinea. As Allied forces gained ground in the region, Japanese troops retreated deep into the dense jungles, taking their prisoners along to aid in establishing new encampments. Surrender was not an option for these Japanese soldiers, so they persisted in fighting despite the rapidly diminishing territory. Cut off from supply lines and devoid of reinforcements, they faced dire food shortages. Initially, they attempted to hunt the Aboriginal people of Papua New Guinea, but their superior knowledge of the land made them elusive targets. The Japanese also considered killing Australian soldiers for sustenance, but the difficulty of such an endeavour proved insurmountable. Consequently, they turned to the prisoners under their control. While the Japanese needed them for labour, the agonizing pangs of hunger overwhelmed any sense of reason. A survivor, a Pakistani corporal who had been a prisoner in Papua New Guinea, recounted that toward the war's end, Japanese soldiers were killing and consuming one prisoner each day. This grisly ritual continued for approximately 100 days, implying that over 100 individuals were devoured by Japanese soldiers in Papua New Guinea alone. The other prisoners would bear witness each night as one of them was selected as a sacrificial offering, allowing their Japanese captors to satiate their hunger. Survivors reported hearing screams emanating from a small hut echoing through the jungle. It appeared that victims were flayed alive, and those who survived the amputation of limbs would be cast into a ditch, left to bleed out while praying for death. When questioned about their actions, Japanese soldiers revealed unsettling information. While cannibalism was primarily driven by the need to survive, it was not always the sole motivation. In one soldier's trial, he admitted that when he killed and consumed an Australian soldier, it was rooted in both starvation and an intense hatred for the enemy. It is crucial to remember that not every Japanese soldier engaged in cannibalism, as these were isolated incidents. Furthermore, the majority would never have resorted to consuming human flesh if they were not on the brink of starvation. During the early stages of the war, Australia and its surrounding region endured intense bombings and fierce battles. In February 1942, the Japanese launched an attack on mainland Australia, bombing Darwin and Broome. Over the following year, they conducted 97 air raids on the country. Meanwhile, Japanese midget submarines infiltrated Sydney Harbour, bombarding the suburbs surrounding the city. The Australian military occasionally captured these submarines, only to find the 2 Japanese soldiers inside had committed suicide to evade capture. As Australian troops pushed the Japanese forces back toward Asia, they encountered the cannibalism of their own compatriots. Advancing from one island to the next, they meticulously cleared them of any enemy presence. Upon reaching the larger islands of Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, they faced more substantial resistance and stumbled upon abandoned Japanese encampments scattered with human remains. The bones bore signs of butchery. Towards the war's end, desperate Japanese soldiers left to fend for themselves were discovered in these camps, unveiling the horrifying truth of cannibalism. As Australian soldiers and other Allied forces advanced through the Pacific Islands, they encountered Japanese camps where they discovered the remains of captured Australian soldiers. Shockingly, only the hands and feet of these soldiers remained, indicating that the rest of their bodies had been consumed. This suggests that cannibalism was occurring among groups of Japanese soldiers throughout the Pacific Theater. While not all soldiers resorted to such extreme measures, some who were desperate to survive turned to cannibalism as a means of last resort. Surrendering to Japanese soldiers was considered a worse fate than consuming human flesh. However, it's important to note that Japanese soldiers were not the only ones who engaged in cannibalism during World War II. In other instances of extreme starvation, people were driven to consume human remains in order to stay alive. One notorious example took place during the siege of Leningrad. As the city endured freezing temperatures, lack of supplies, and the inability to grow food, the starving population resorted to eating the remains of the deceased. With hunger overpowering rational thought, there were even accounts of individuals cutting off their own flesh for sustenance. Similarly, after the Battle of Stalingrad, approximately 100,000 German soldiers who were captured were sent to POW camps in Siberia and Central Asia by the Soviets. In these harsh conditions, where the Germans were provided with inadequate food and water, they turned to cannibalism to survive the brutal winters. Only around 5,000 out of the 100,000 German captives survived until the end of the war, highlighting the dire circumstances they faced. In the independent state of Croatia, a Nazi puppet state, several concentration and death camps were established to carry out Hitler's final solution. Under the rule of the fascist Ustasha organization, genocidal acts were committed against Serbs and Jews, aligning with the Nazi agenda. Disturbingly, it was documented that when victims had their throats slashed by Ustashas, the perpetrators would collect the flowing blood in cups and ritually consume it. This demonstrates that not all instances of cannibalism during World War II were driven solely by survival. Some involved perverse rituals and ideologies. there are indications that certain Japanese military officers fostered a cult-like understanding of cannibalism among their ranks. Numerous Japanese soldiers have given accounts stating that they were forced to consume human flesh and liver by their superiors, even when they were not in a state of starvation. Refusal to participate in such acts would result in reprimands from the commanding officers, and in extreme cases, physical coercion was employed. The justification for these actions was sometimes linked back to the Second Sino-Japanese War, where consuming the flesh of enemies was believed to grant invincibility in battle. Some high-ranking officials who forced their subordinates to engage in cannibalism during World War II had previously fought in that conflict, which began in 1937. Furthermore, there is compelling evidence that cannibalism was a prevalent problem among Japanese troops during World War II in the Pacific. On November 18, 1944, a secret Imperial Army order was issued by the Japanese government addressing the issue of cannibalism. Surprisingly, the order did not unequivocally condemn the act. While cannibalizing fellow Japanese soldiers was deemed the worst human crime resulting from a lack of thoroughness in moral training, consuming the flesh of the enemy was not punished as a crime. The government acknowledged cannibalism as a problem but chose to overlook instances where the enemy was the source of the consumed flesh. At the war's end, many Japanese soldiers and officers found guilty of engaging in cannibalism were tried for war crimes and received death sentences. The Japanese government has since avoided public discussion or education about this aspect of their history, considering it too sensitive. Consequently, Japanese scholars seeking to delve into and publish information about these wartime atrocities often pursue opportunities outside of Japan, including positions in Australia and other universities worldwide. It is essential to emphasize that cannibalism was not the norm for Japanese troops, and it was not a reflection of Japanese society or culture as a whole. While there may have been a cult-like group within certain military ranks that incorporated ritualistic cannibalism, concrete evidence supporting this notion remains elusive. The majority of soldiers who engaged in cannibalism did so out of sheer desperation to survive, much like in other historical instances where extreme circumstances pushed people to such extremes. The actions of a few should not be generalized to the entire Japanese population, and the wartime atrocities should be viewed as isolated incidents rather than representative of Japanese culture.